Okay, in this video I'm going to talk about what to do when you have the negation of a complex sentence, and in particular, what do you do when you have the negation of a conjunction. So let's look at this derivation. So we have not Q is our conclusion, so we'll go ahead and make an assumption as we do, because we always want to make an assumption unless, well, we usually want to make an assumption unless we know there's a reason we don't need to, and we have to make an indirect assumption. So we'll say Q. And that's what we want to do also because it's a negation. Now let's bring in our premises. Okay, so we have Q, we have not, P and Q, and we have P. Now, what can we do with 3? Not much. There's a version of DM that applies to it, but you probably don't have that, and you don't need it. But there are no other rules we can apply, right? Well, I mean, maybe. Let's think about it. How are we going to end this derivation? Well, we made an indirect assumption to start with, so probably we want to finish indirectly. And if we want to finish indirectly, that means we want to get a contradiction. And how do we get a contradiction? Well, we get a sentence or its negation. Okay, so what's the negation? The negation of line 2 would be not Q. And the negation of line 4 would be not P. It's not clear how we would get either not Q or not P. If we got not Q, we could say on line 8, we could say 28 ID. If we got not P on line 10, we could say 410 ID. But it's not clear where we would get not Q or not P from. 3 is a negation of the conjunction. 3 does not say that both P and Q are false. It says it says the conjunction P and Q is false, which means that at least one of P and Q is false. But it doesn't tell us that they're both false, right? If what would tell us that we're both false is that. And we could apply simplification to this, right? Because it's a conjunction. But we can't apply simplification to 3 because it's not a conjunction. Okay. So it's not clear where we get not Q or not P from. What about 3? Well, the contradiction of 3 is P and Q. So if we could get P and Q, then we could box and cancel with ID. And indeed, we can get P and Q because we can apply a join to 4 and 2. And that gives us P and Q because 4 is P and 2 is Q. So now we have what we need for an indirect derivation. We have the negation of a conjunction on line 3, and we have the unnegated conjunction on line 5, which means 3 and 5 are contradiction, which means we can box and cancel with ID. Good. Let's look at another example. Well, this time the conclusion is not P, so again, let's make an indirect assumption. Let's bring in our two premises. This is exactly the same, except the order of P and Q are reversed. So again, we can put together P with Q. We can adjoin P with Q. We form P and Q, and we have a contradiction between 3 and 5. So the only difference was that the premise and the conclusion were basic. The second premise in the previous one was P, and whereas this time it's Q. The conclusion in the previous one was not Q. This time it's not P. So very similar problems. Let's look at another problem. Here our conclusion is again not Q, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3. Okay, so we have Q, not P and Q, if Z then P and Z. Well, this time there's actually an elimination rule we can apply. We can apply modus ponens with 4 and 5 and we get P. And now we have P and Q, and there's that negation P and Q, so again we can put together P with Q, we can adjoin P with Q, and again we have a contradiction. Oops. So there we go. And let's look at just one more. So here, we're trying to show a conditional. So let's make a conditional assumption. And, well, we know that if we get not Q, we can box and cancel. So let's go ahead and say show cons not Q. Maybe we need to do it, maybe we don't. In fact, in this case, we do, as we'll see shortly. So now we have P on one line, Q on another. We bring in our premise, and oh, it's the same thing. There's negation of P and Q. What do we do with negation P and Q? Well, if we can build P and Q, we can ID, and we have P and Q, so we can adjoin them, and we can get an indirect derivation. Okay, 3 is the consequent of line 1, so we can apply 3 CD to line 3, and that boxes and cancels line 1. And so, again, it works. So the general strategy here is, if you have negation P and Q, then get P and Q and apply ID, right? That's what we did in all 4 of these, and that is in general what you want to do. If you see, oh, I have negation P and Q, how do I handle that? Build P and Q, and then apply ID. Now, in this case, this subderivation, show cons, was necessary. Without it, what do we have? We have P, and we have negation P and Q. And those by themselves, we're not getting anywhere with. We can't do anything with those by themselves to get to not Q. We can't extract a contradiction out of them. So in this case, we have to do this subderivation because it gives us, when we do this subderivation, we then get Q as the assumption, which lets us form P and Q, which lets us get a contradiction. And then once we cancel the show line not Q, then we can use the not. We don't need the Q anymore. The Q is boxed and we don't need it anymore. But we use the assumption of Q to get us to not Q, as indirectly we do. And then we say, good, now CD. I did those in slightly different order, but it's the same thing happens in both of them. We show not Q, make an assumption, get a contradiction. Once we've canceled show not Q, we then use not Q to box and cancel the whole thing. But the fundamental thing is working with negations of conjunction. So if you have, again, if you have the negation of a conjunction, then you want to get P and Q and apply ID. And how are you going to get P and Q? Well, we talked about that in the previous video. Maybe you just have the P's and the Q's. You more or less do in the problems we've been looking at. Or maybe you have to do more involved stuff to get them. But you want to get them one way or another, and then you apply ID. So that's how you want to work with the negation of a conjunction. If you have the negation of a conjunction, build the conjunction. If you're trying to show the negation of a conjunction, if you're trying to show not P and Q, then you just do assume ID, right? That's all. You know what to do with that. Where negations of conjunctions are tricky, not when you're trying to show them, but when you have them. What do you do with them? Your rules don't apply, except you can use them with ID. Okay, good. So I hope that's clarified what to do with negated conjunctions.